This is the true story of America's first daylight bank robbery. On February 13th, 1866, in the small town of Liberty, Missouri, a gang of outlaws walked into the Clay County Savings Association and changed criminal history forever. Tonight, you'll witness this groundbreaking crime exactly as it unfolded, step by step, minute by minute. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. While the men you'll meet are fictional characters based on historical evidence, everything else is absolutely real. The town of Liberty still exists. The bank building still stands. You can visit it today. The snow-covered streets, the $60,000 they stole, even the tragic death of a 19-year-old college student caught in the crossfire, all documented historical fact. So how did a group of former Confederate guerrillas plan the perfect crime in broad daylight? Why did they choose a peaceful Tuesday afternoon when the entire town could see them? And most mysteriously, how did they vanish without a trace into a Missouri blizzard, leaving behind only footprints in the snow and a mystery that historians still debate today? Tonight, we're going back to 1866, to a Missouri still bleeding from the Civil War, where desperate men with nothing left to lose decided to take what they needed from those who had supported the Union. Back to a time when banks were just wooden buildings with simple locks, when law enforcement meant one sheriff for an entire county, and when the wrong choice could mean a rope around your neck before sunset. This is the story of the robbery that created the template every bank heist would follow. The crime that turned unknown farm boys into legendary outlaws. The 20 minutes that changed American criminal history forever. And it all began with a simple request to change a $10 bill. February 13th, 1866. Liberty, Missouri. The morning dawned gray and bitter cold, with the kind of penetrating chill that made your bones ache and your breath form clouds in the still air. Snow had fallen during the night, not the heavy blanketing kind that shut down all activity, but a light dusting that made the world look clean and new, while hiding the mud and horse droppings that normally characterized the streets of a frontier town. Liberty was a modest place in those days, home to perhaps 800 souls clustered around a central square dominated by the imposing Clay County Courthouse. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the arrival of strangers was noted and discussed over coffee and cornbread, where the rhythm of daily life had remained unchanged since before the war that had torn the nation apart. But Liberty was also a town trying to heal. Missouri had been a border state during the conflict, torn between North and South, Union and Confederate, neighbor against neighbor. The scars ran deep here. You could see it in the way certain families refused to speak to others, in the burnt foundations where homes had once stood, in the haunted eyes of men who'd seen too much killing and come home to find their world forever changed. The Clay County Savings Association sat on the northeast corner of the town square, a modest two-story brick building that had opened for business in 1864, when the war was still raging and paper money was worth less than the promises it was printed on. The building itself was nothing fancy. Federal-style architecture, simple and sturdy, built to last rather than impress. But inside that unremarkable structure lay something precious in post-war Missouri: stability. The bank was owned by a group of Republican businessmen, former Union militia officers who'd stayed loyal to the federal government throughout the conflict. In a county where Confederate sympathies ran deep, this made them targets for resentment, but it also made them survivors. They'd weathered the worst years of the war, kept their business intact, and now served a community desperate for financial security. On this particular Tuesday morning, as Liberty began its daily routine of survival and commerce, two men were preparing to open the Clay County Savings Association for another day of business. Greenup Bird, the head cashier, was a careful man in his 40s with the pale complexion and ink-stained fingers that marked him as someone who worked with ledgers rather than plows. He'd been with the bank since its founding, had seen it through the uncertain war years, and took pride in the trust the community placed in his institution. Working alongside him was his son, William Bird, barely 20 years old and eager to prove himself worthy of his father's profession. William had the quick mind and steady hands that banking required, but he also had the restless energy of youth in a place where opportunities seemed as scarce as warmth on a February morning. The Birds had arrived at the bank at their usual time, 7:30 sharp, following a routine that never varied. Unlock the heavy wooden door with its brass fittings. Light the oil lamps that would provide illumination throughout the day. Check the simple iron safe where the bank's modest treasure lay, secured behind a lock that had seemed quite sophisticated when ordered from St. Louis 2 years earlier. The safe contained exactly $57,022 in various forms, gold coins that caught the lamplight and sang when they touched each other, silver dollars that bore the weight of real value, government bonds issued by a federal treasury finally showing signs of stability, and paper currency that people were slowly beginning to trust again. It wasn't a fortune by Eastern standards, but in Liberty, Missouri, it represented the accumulated hopes and dreams of hundreds of families. Outside, the town was slowly coming to life. Smoke rose from chimneys as wives stoked fires for the day's cooking. Children hurried past on their way to school, their breath forming small clouds as they laughed and called to each other. Horses stamped their feet at hitching posts, occasionally whinnying softly in the cold air. The blacksmith's hammer had already begun its rhythmic song, and the general store was preparing for another day of small transactions and large gossip. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be. And 12 miles to the southeast, in a grove of oak trees along the banks of Fishing River, 7 men were saddling their horses and preparing to make history. The leader of this group was a man we'll call Samuel Clement. Not his real name, of course, because real names were dangerous things in Missouri in 1866. Samuel was 24 years old, though he looked older. The war had aged him, as it had aged every man who'd survived 4 years of neighbor killing neighbor, of midnight raids and dawn ambushes, of a kind of fighting that made monsters out of farm boys and heroes out of men who'd never wanted to hurt anyone. Samuel had ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the war, part of the irregular Confederate forces that had turned the Missouri-Kansas border into a killing ground. He'd learned to shoot from horseback, to live rough, to trust no one who hadn't bled beside him. When the war ended, Samuel had tried to go home, tried to pick up the pieces of the life he'd left behind when he was 19 years old and full of righteous fury at the Union invasion of his homeland. But home was gone. His family's farm had been burned by Union militia in retaliation for his guerrilla activities. His parents were dead. His father killed in a skirmish, his mother dead of grief and fever. His younger sister had married a Union sympathizer and refused to speak to him. The girl he'd planned to marry had wed someone else, someone who'd had the good sense to stay out of the war. So, Samuel had drifted, like thousands of other former Confederate guerrillas. Men too proud to submit to Reconstruction and too bitter to forgive. He'd tried honest work, farm labor, freight hauling, anything that would put food in his belly and a roof over his head. But everywhere he went, the war followed him. Former Union men wouldn't hire him. Federal authorities watched him. Local sheriffs made it clear that his kind wasn't welcome in their communities. That's how Samuel had found himself on this cold February morning, preparing to commit a crime that would either set him free or get him hanged. The 6 men with him were cut from the same cloth: former guerrillas, displaced persons, men whose world had been destroyed, and who decided that if they couldn't rebuild it, they'd at least profit from its ruins. There was David Martinez, a wiry man whose family had fled Kansas after the Lawrence raid. Thomas Wright, barely 18, who'd lost his father at Wilson's Creek and his brothers at Pea Ridge. James Cunningham, older than the rest, who'd been riding with irregular cavalry since the fighting began and didn't know any other way to live. They were, in short, exactly the kind of men you'd expect to find planning a bank robbery in post-war Missouri. Desperate, skilled, and with nothing left to lose. Samuel checked his pocket watch, a Union officer's timepiece he'd taken during the war and kept as both trophy and tool. 9 o'clock. Time to ride. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, his breath forming a small cloud in the frigid air, "today we make our own Reconstruction." They mounted their horses and began the 12-mile ride toward Liberty, moving in pairs to avoid attracting attention, following roads they'd scouted carefully over the past 2 weeks. Behind them, their morning campfire sent a thin column of smoke into the gray sky, the last evidence of their presence before they rode into history. In exactly 5 hours, the Clay County Savings Association would be robbed of everything in its vault. A young man would die in the street, and America would witness its first daylight bank robbery during peacetime, setting a precedent that would echo through criminal history for decades to come. But for now, in the quiet of a Missouri morning, Liberty remained peaceful, unaware that 7 riders were approaching with revolution in their hearts and robbery on their minds. The ride from their campsite to Liberty took the better part of 5 hours, not because of distance, but because of caution. These were men who'd survived 4 years of irregular warfare by being careful, by studying their enemies, by never taking unnecessary risks. They moved through the Missouri countryside like shadows, using tree lines for cover, avoiding main roads, stopping frequently to listen for sounds that didn't belong. The landscape they traveled through told the story of a region still healing from war. Burnt farmhouses dotted the countryside, their blackened chimneys standing like tombstones marking the graves of lost dreams. Fields lay fallow, either because their owners were dead or because there was no money for seed, no hands to work the soil, no guarantee that what you planted wouldn't be destroyed by the next raiding party that came through. But there were also signs of recovery. Smoke rising from rebuilt cabins, cattle grazing in pastures where grass was slowly reclaiming the scars left by cavalry charges, the sound of axes biting into wood as men worked to replace what the war had taken away. Missouri was healing, slowly and painfully, but it was healing. Samuel and his men represented the other side of that equation, the men who couldn't heal, who carried their wounds like banners, who decided that if they couldn't rebuild, they'd at least survive. As they drew closer to Liberty, they began to see more signs of life. A farmer loading hay onto a wagon, children playing in a schoolyard, a woman hanging laundry despite the cold, because clean clothes were a luxury worth pursuing, even when your breath froze in the air. Normal life. The kind of life Samuel had once thought he'd live. By noon, they could see the town spread out before them, a cluster of buildings arranged around the courthouse square, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys, the orderly pattern of streets that marked civilization in the wilderness. It looked peaceful, prosperous, untouched by the violence that had shaped so much of Missouri over the past 5 years. "Pretty little place," murmured David Martinez, his Spanish accent barely detectable after years on the frontier. "Shame to disturb it." They had their chance for peace, Samuel replied, his voice carrying the hardness that had kept him alive through the war. They chose sides. Now they live with the consequences. They approached Liberty from the southeast, following a route that would bring them into town, along Franklin Street, past the residence where William Jewell had once lived, before founding the college that bore his name. The college itself sat on a hill overlooking the town, a symbol of learning and progress that felt like mockery to men who'd received their education in the school of hard war. At 1:30, they reached the outskirts of town and paused to make their final preparations. The horses were checked one last time, girths tightened, bits adjusted, shoes examined for any sign of looseness that might mean the difference between escape and capture. Weapons were inspected with the care of men whose lives depended on mechanical reliability. Pocket watches were synchronized with the precision of a military operation. Samuel gathered his men around him for final instructions. "Remember," he said quietly, "we're businessmen conducting legitimate business. We enter town calmly. We conduct our affairs professionally, and we depart without unseemly haste. No unnecessary talk, no displays of temper, no actions that might be misunderstood." It was the same kind of briefing he'd given before raids during the war, when success meant survival and failure meant federal prison or a rope. The methods were the same, even if the motivation had shifted from ideology to simple survival. Thomas Wright, the youngest of the group, shifted nervously in his saddle. "What if someone recognizes us?" "They won't," Samuel said with quiet confidence. "We're strangers here, just travelers with business to conduct." But even as he spoke, Samuel knew the risks. Liberty was a small town where strangers were noticed, where 7 men arriving together would inevitably attract attention. They were gambling that their appearance would be unremarkable enough to avoid suspicion, until it was too late for suspicion to matter. At precisely 2:00, the time when most businesses had reopened after the noon meal, when the maximum number of people would be on the streets to provide cover for their activities, they rode into Liberty. The town looked exactly as their scouting had suggested. The courthouse dominated the square, a solid symbol of legal authority that would soon be challenged by a different kind of power. Around it, businesses catered to the needs of farmers, tradesmen, and the modest professional class that kept frontier communities functioning. And there, on the northeast corner of the square, stood their target, the Clay County Savings Association. 2 stories of red brick and white mortar, with windows that caught the afternoon light and a door that welcomed customers to deposit their trust along with their money. Samuel could see movement through the windows. 2 figures moving about their daily business, unaware that they were about to become part of history. The sight should have made him feel something. Guilt, perhaps, or at least regret at what was about to happen. Instead, he felt only the cold calculation that had carried him through 4 years of war. "Positions," he said quietly. 5 of his men took their assigned places around the square, positioning themselves to watch for law enforcement, to control the streets leading away from the bank, and to provide covering fire if the situation deteriorated. They did this with the smooth efficiency of men who'd practiced urban warfare in places like Lawrence and Centralia, where civilian areas had become battlefields. Samuel and James Cunningham dismounted in front of the bank, their movements casual and unhurried. They tied their horses to the hitching rail with the same careful attention they'd given to everything else, loose enough for a quick getaway, secure enough to avoid suspicion. As they walked toward the door of the Clay County Savings Association, Samuel could feel his pulse quicken slightly. Not from fear. He'd been too close to death too many times to fear much of anything, but from anticipation. In a few minutes, he would either be rich enough to start over somewhere far from Missouri's bitter memories, or he would be starting down the path that led to a hangman's noose. The brass doorknob was cold under his gloved hand. Behind the door, he could hear voices, father and son, conducting the mundane business of frontier banking, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Samuel took a deep breath of the frigid February air and opened the door. Inside, the Clay County Savings Association smelled of wood polish and lamp oil, paper and ink. Afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. At the teller's window, William Byrd was carefully counting coins, his movements precise and practiced. Behind him, his father Greenup was reviewing a ledger, his wire-rimmed spectacles reflecting the light from the oil lamps. Both men looked up as Samuel and James entered, their faces showing the mild curiosity that strangers always provoked in small towns. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Greenup Byrd said pleasantly. What can we do for you today?" Samuel removed his hat with courteous precision, the gesture of a man who'd been raised properly despite what circumstances had made of him. "Good afternoon," he replied, his voice carrying none of the tension he felt. "I wonder if you might change a $10 bill for me. I need smaller denominations for some purchases." It was such an ordinary request, the kind of transaction that happened dozens of times each week. Greenup nodded agreeably and began to move. In that moment, with the routine politeness of frontier commerce masking the reality of what was about to unfold, America's first daylight bank robbery began. The brass bell above the door had barely finished chiming when everything changed. Samuel's right hand moved with the fluid precision of a man who'd drawn weapons under fire, producing a Colt Navy revolver that seemed to materialize from inside his heavy coat. Beside him, James Cunningham's own pistol appeared with equal speed, both men covering the bank's interior with the smooth coordination of partners who'd worked together before. "Gentlemen," Samuel said, his voice remaining conversational despite the deadly steel in his hands, "I'm afraid we need to revise our transaction." The effect on the Byrds was immediate and devastating. William, barely 20 years old and more accustomed to ledgers than loaded revolvers, went pale as morning mist. His hands, which had been so steady with columns of figures, began to shake violently. Behind him, his father Greenup stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he struggled to comprehend what was happening in his orderly world. "Please don't be alarmed," Samuel continued, his tone almost apologetic. "We're here on business, just not the kind you usually conduct. If you cooperate fully, no one needs to be hurt." The words were chosen carefully. Samuel and his men had discussed this extensively during their planning. Violence attracted attention, and attention brought federal marshals. Better to accomplish their goals through intimidation and superior preparation than through the kind of bloody confrontation that had marked their wartime activities. James Cunningham moved to the door, positioning himself where he could watch the street while keeping an eye on the interior. Through the windows, he could see their associates taking their assigned positions around the square, casual figures who would appear to be ordinary townspeople until circumstances required them to become something else entirely. "The safe," Samuel said, gesturing toward the iron strongbox that dominated the back wall of the bank. "Open it, please." Greenup Byrd found his voice at last, though it came out as little more than a whisper. We can't. There are procedures." Samuel's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes grew colder. "Mr. Byrd, and it is Mr. Byrd, isn't it? Let me explain our situation. We've come a long way to conduct this business. We've planned carefully, and we've prepared for various contingencies. Opening that safe is not a request. It's a requirement." To emphasize his point, Samuel thumbed back the hammer on his revolver, the mechanical click echoing in the suddenly silent bank like a death knell. Greenup Byrd was a brave man. You had to be brave to run a Republican bank in Confederate-sympathizing Clay County. But he was also a practical one. He could see the competence in these men, the casual way they handled their weapons, the coordination that spoke of military experience. These weren't desperate amateurs who might be reasoned with or frightened off. These were professionals conducting professional business. With shaking hands, he moved toward the safe. The combination was burned into his memory. 152437. Numbers that had seemed so secure when the safe was installed, so impossible for any outsider to guess. Now, under the steady gaze of armed men, they felt as flimsy as paper promises. The safe opened with a solid click of tumblers falling into alignment, revealing the accumulated wealth of the Clay County Savings Association. Gold coins caught the lamplight, their surfaces gleaming like captured sunshine. Silver dollars sat in neat stacks, each one representing days of honest labor. Government bonds, paper currency, tax stamps, all the instruments of commerce that kept a frontier community functioning. Samuel produced a canvas sack from inside his coat, the kind used for grain or flour, innocent in appearance, but perfectly suited for transporting large quantities of small, valuable objects. "If you would, Mr. Bird," he said politely, gesturing toward the safe's contents. What followed was perhaps the most civilized robbery in American history up to that point. Green-up Bird, his hands steadier now that he'd accepted the inevitable, methodically transferred the bank's wealth into Samuel's sack. Gold coins clinked softly against each other. Paper money rustled like autumn leaves. The bonds, carefully bundled, represented not just monetary value but the faith of a federal government finally beginning to establish stability after 4 years of civil war. Outside, life and liberty continued its normal patterns. A woman walked past the bank windows, carrying a basket of eggs for trade at the general store. Children played in the square, their laughter mixing with the sound of horses and wagon wheels on the hard-packed earth. The blacksmith's hammer continued its rhythmic song, and somewhere a dog barked once, before falling silent. None of them knew that history was being made 20 feet away, behind the innocent facade of the Clay County Savings Association. William Byrd, meanwhile, had moved beyond fear into a kind of fascinated horror. He watched the systematic emptying of his father's bank with the detached interest of a man observing a natural disaster. Terrible, but impossible to look away from. Part of his mind was cataloging details that might later help identify the robbers: height, weight, clothing, speech patterns, distinguishing marks. The other part was simply trying to process the reality that his orderly world had been turned upside down by 2 calm men with loaded revolvers. "That's everything from the safe," Greenup said quietly, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who just watched his life's work disappear into a grain sack. Samuel tested the weight of the sack, estimating its contents with the practiced eye of a man who'd handled significant amounts of money before. Close to $60,000 if their intelligence about the bank's holdings had been accurate, enough to set 7 men up for new lives far from the bitter memories of Missouri. "Excellent," he said, securing the sack inside his coat. "Now, gentlemen, I need you to understand something very clearly. We're going to leave now, and you're going to remain exactly where you are for the next 10 minutes. You're not going to move, you're not going to call for help, and you're not going to do anything that might be misinterpreted as an attempt to raise an alarm. Is this clear?" Both men nodded, though William's nod was more like a convulsive jerk. "Good," Samuel continued. "After we've departed, you're free to conduct your business as you see fit. But I want you to remember that we're professionals, and professionals take precautions. If we're pursued too quickly, If there are complications to our departure, we'll be forced to take measures that none of us would prefer." It was a polite way of threatening to return and finish what they'd started, but the threat was unmistakable. Samuel had learned during the war that the most effective intimidation was often the kind that left details to the imagination. James Cunningham had been watching the street throughout the entire transaction, his eyes constantly moving, cataloging threats and opportunities. Now he caught Samuel's eye and nodded toward the door. "Time to go." "Gentlemen," Samuel said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy, "it's been a pleasure doing business with you." And with that, America's first daylight bank robbers walked calmly out of the Clay County Savings Association and into the cold Missouri afternoon, where their horses waited and their associates maintained watch, and where a 19-year-old college student named George Wymore was about to become an unwitting part of criminal history. The brass bell above the door chimed softly as it closed behind them, the same welcoming sound it had made when they entered. Inside the bank, two men stood frozen in shock, trying to comprehend what had just happened to their carefully ordered world. Outside, 7 horsemen were about to attempt an escape that would either make them legends or get them hanged before sunset. The first thing Samuel noticed as he stepped out of the bank was how normal everything looked. The town square continued its afternoon routine as if nothing had changed. A farmer was loading supplies into his wagon outside the general store. 2 women gossiped on the steps of the courthouse. Children played near the horse trough, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air. For a moment, Samuel allowed himself to believe that they might actually escape cleanly, without violence, without the kind of complications that turned simple robberies into the stuff of wanted posters and federal investigations. That moment lasted exactly 7 seconds. George Wymore was 19 years old, a student at William Jewell College with dreams of studying law, maybe even politics. He was walking across the square with the casual confidence of youth, heading toward the college where he had an appointment with Professor Henderson about his Latin translations. George was the kind of young man who noticed things, an observant habit that served him well in his studies, and would, in about 30 seconds, cost him his life. What George noticed was 7 men positioned around the town square in a pattern that didn't make sense for casual visitors. What he noticed was 2 men emerging from the bank, moving with purpose, rather than the leisurely pace of satisfied customers. What he noticed was the way these men's hands stayed close to their coats, the way their eyes constantly swept the street, the way they moved like soldiers on patrol rather than businessmen conducting commerce. George Wymore was young, but he wasn't stupid. He'd grown up during the war years, had seen enough irregular cavalry and guerrilla raids to recognize military bearing when he saw it. And what he was seeing now, in the peaceful square of Liberty, Missouri, looked very much like the prelude to trouble. So George did what any civic-minded young man would do in 1866. He started walking toward the sheriff's office to report his suspicions. Samuel saw him moving and understood immediately what was happening. During the war, he'd learned to read intention in a man's posture, to recognize threat in the angle of a stride. George Wymore might as well have been carrying a sign announcing his plans to raise the alarm. "Problem," James Cunningham murmured, following Samuel's gaze. Samuel's mind raced through options with the speed that had kept him alive through 4 years of irregular warfare. They could try to intercept the boy, but that meant crossing the square in a way that would definitely attract attention. They could ignore him and hope to be gone before any alarm became effective, but that was gambling their lives on the speed of their horses versus the speed of local law enforcement. Or, the decision was made for him by Thomas Wright, the 18-year-old who joined their group more for adventure than for any clear understanding of consequences. Thomas saw the same threat Samuel had identified, but his solution was more direct and infinitely more tragic. The shot rang out across the square like thunder, echoing off the courthouse walls and freezing every conversation, every movement, every breath in Liberty, Missouri. George Wymore stumbled, looked down at the spreading red stain on his white shirt with the confused expression of a man who couldn't quite understand what had just happened to him, and collapsed into the snow. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, the town square remained silent, except for the echo of gunfire fading into the winter air. Then, as if the sound had broken a spell, everything exploded into chaos. Women screamed, children began crying. Men who'd been conducting peaceful business suddenly remembered they were armed and began reaching for weapons. Horses reared and plunged, spooked by the sudden violence. And somewhere, a voice began shouting the words that would transform their carefully planned withdrawal into a desperate flight for their lives. "Bank robbery! The bank's been robbed!" Samuel cursed with creative fluency as he swung into his saddle, his carefully orchestrated plan dissolving into the kind of violent confusion he'd hoped to avoid. Around the square, his men were mounting their horses with varying degrees of urgency, their positions chosen for surveillance and control, now serving as rally points for escape. But the damage was done. What should have been a quiet departure had become a running gunfight in broad daylight, witnessed by dozens of people who would remember every detail and pass them along to every law enforcement officer in Missouri. More shots began ringing out as townspeople retrieved rifles and pistols from shops and homes. Samuel heard a bullet crack past his head and saw wood splinters fly from a hitching post beside him. These weren't trained soldiers they were facing, but there were a lot of them. And in a target-rich environment, accuracy mattered less than volume of fire. "Ride!" Samuel shouted, spurring his horse toward the street that led southeast out of town. Around him, his men were scattering according to their planned escape routes, but the plan had assumed they'd have several minutes head start before any pursuit could be organized. Now, they were running a gauntlet of increasingly organized resistance. James Cunningham's horse stumbled as they reached the edge of the square, a red stain spreading along its neck where a lucky shot had creased it. The animal recovered and kept running, but it was clearly wounded and wouldn't last long at the pace they needed to maintain. Behind them, the town of Liberty was transforming from a peaceful agricultural community into something that looked like a military objective under assault. Men were running toward the livery stable to saddle horses. Others were taking positions behind buildings and wagons, turning the town square into a killing field for anyone foolish enough to linger there. And in the Clay County Savings Association, Greenup and William Byrd were finally moving, running toward the door to see what had happened, to understand how their quiet Tuesday afternoon had exploded into violence and chaos, and the kind of trouble that would haunt their community for decades. Samuel's group reached the outskirts of town and pressed their horses into a full gallop, the animals' hooves throwing up clouds of snow and frozen earth. Behind them, Liberty was organizing itself for pursuit with the grim efficiency of a community that had learned hard lessons about responding to violence during the war years. But they had one crucial advantage. While the town was reacting to what had already happened, Samuel and his men were focused on what came next. They knew where they were going. They had planned for pursuit, and they had a 12-hour head start on the kind of systematic manhunt that would follow once word of America's first daylight bank robbery spread beyond the borders of Clay County. The snow that had made the morning beautiful was now working in their favor, muffling the sound of their horses' hooves and promising to obscure their tracks if the weather continued. Behind them, George Wymore lay dying in the town's square, his blood bright red against the white snow, the first casualty of a new kind of American crime. Ahead lay either freedom or the gallows. But first, they had to survive the next few hours, and the posse that was already forming to hunt them down. The pursuit began within minutes of the robbers' departure, but those minutes might as well have been hours in terms of advantage gained. While the townspeople of Liberty were still trying to understand what had happened, Samuel and his men were already 2 miles out of town and riding hard toward terrain they'd chosen specifically for its defensive advantages. Sheriff James Jones arrived at the scene of the shooting as Dr. William Jewell knelt beside George Wymore's still form in the blood-stained snow. The young man was beyond help. The bullet had torn through his chest, and he died looking up at the gray February sky with confusion still written on his face. He would be remembered as the first victim of peacetime bank robbery in American history, a distinction that would have meant nothing to him as his life bled away into the winter afternoon. "How many?" Jones asked grimly, his breath forming clouds in the cold air as he surveyed the chaos around the town square. 7, maybe 8, replied Henry Crawford, who'd seen the robbers from his position outside the general store. Well-mounted, well-armed, moved like soldiers. Jones nodded grimly. Former guerrillas, most likely? Confederate irregulars who'd never accepted the end of the war and had turned their military skills to criminal purposes. Missouri was full of such men, and every sheriff in the state had been expecting something like this to happen. Within 30 minutes, Jones had assembled a posse of 12 men, all mounted on the best horses Liberty could provide. They included several Union veterans who'd fought against Confederate cavalry and understood the kind of chase they were undertaking. These weren't ordinary criminals who could be tracked down by overwhelming numbers and righteous anger. These were men who'd spent 4 years learning how to disappear into countryside. They knew intimately how to use terrain to their advantage and how to fight their way out of seemingly impossible situations. The trail leading southeast from town was clear enough at first. 7 sets of hoof prints in the light snow, heading toward the broken country along Fishing River, where 1,000 hiding places waited among the oak groves and limestone bluffs. But as the posse pressed their pursuit, the trail began to fragment and disperse, splitting into smaller groups that used every trick of woodcraft to obscure their passage. Samuel had divided his men according to a plan worked out during their weeks of preparation. 3 riders continued southeast toward the river bottoms, laying a clear trail that would draw the main pursuit. 2 others broke off toward the north, making for the Missouri River and a crossing point they'd identified during their reconnaissance. And Samuel himself, along with James Cunningham, headed due east toward a safe house they'd prepared in a barn owned by a Confederate widow who asked no questions about visitors arriving at odd hours. It was a classic military maneuver adapted to civilian purposes. Divide the enemy's attention, force them to make choices about which trail to follow, and use the confusion to escape while they were still deciding. The tactics that had served Confederate cavalry so well during the war were proving equally effective against civilian law enforcement. Sheriff Jones made the decision to follow the main trail southeast, reasoning that the largest group would contain the leadership and most of the stolen money. It was logical thinking, but it was exactly what Samuel had hoped he would think. By the time Jones realized he was following a decoy trail, the real prize would be long gone. The chase through the river bottoms became a running battle between men who understood pursuit and men who understood evasion. The 3 robbers Samuel had assigned to lay the false trail were led by David Martinez, whose family had fled Kansas after the Lawrence raid. Martinez knew these woods from hunting trips in his youth, knew every deer path and creek crossing, every place where a horse could ford the river, and every bluff that offered defensive positions. For 3 hours, the posse followed a trail that seemed always just ahead of them. Fresh hoofprints in the snow, broken branches that spoke of hasty passage, even glimpses of riders disappearing around distant bends in the creek. It was masterfully done, a performance that drew the pursuers deeper into country that favored the pursued while leading them steadily away from the real escape routes. But as afternoon faded toward evening, the trail began to grow cold. The hoofprints became older, the broken branches less fresh, and finally, at a place where Fishing River made a sharp bend around a limestone outcrop, the trail simply ended. Sheriff Jones dismounted and studied the ground with the careful attention of a man who'd learned tracking from necessity. The prince led right up to the water's edge, and then nothing. The far bank showed no sign of horses emerging from the river. The rocky shores provided no clear indication of which direction the fugitives might have gone. "They went into the water," observed Tom Mitchell, one of Jones's deputies, stating the obvious with the air of a man making a profound discovery. "Question is, did they come out upstream or downstream?" replied Jones, his voice carrying the frustration of a man beginning to realize he'd been outmaneuvered. "Or did they cross somewhere else entirely?" The answer, had he known it, was that Martinez and his companions had never entered the water at all. At a point half a mile back, where the trail passed through a grove of cedar trees whose thick branches would conceal overhead movement, they'd used a trick learned from Apache scouts during the Indian Wars. Leading their horses carefully along a fallen log that bridged a narrow ravine, they'd left the main trail without leaving tracks, then doubled back through the timber to a secondary route that would take them north toward the Missouri River. By the time Sheriff Jones admitted defeat and began the cold ride back to Liberty, the men he'd been chasing were already 20 miles away and still moving. The stolen money was divided among 3 separate groups, each following a different route toward safety, each prepared to sacrifice their share to ensure the other's escape if circumstances required it. Samuel and James Cunningham reached their safe house just as full darkness fell over Missouri. The barn belonged to a widow named Martha Hendricks, whose husband had died fighting for the Confederate cause and whose son had ridden with Quantrill until a Union bullet found him during the attack on Lawrence. Mrs. Hendricks asked no questions about the 2 men who arrived at her property after dark, leading tired horses and carrying heavy saddlebags. She provided them with food, shelter, and most importantly, silence. In the warm darkness of the barn, surrounded by the familiar smells of hay and horses, Samuel allowed himself to believe they'd actually succeeded. The Clay County Savings Association had yielded exactly what their intelligence had suggested, close to $60,000 in gold, silver, and paper currency. Divided among 7 men, it was enough to provide new lives far from the bitter memories of Missouri. But success in escaping immediate pursuit was only the first challenge. Now came the harder task of turning stolen money into legitimate freedom, of transforming themselves from bank robbers into respectable citizens of communities that would never think to question their sudden prosperity. "What now?" asked James Cunningham, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of their escape. Samuel was cleaning his revolver with the methodical care of a man who'd learned that maintenance might mean the difference between life and death. "Now we disappear," he said quietly, "separately, completely, and forever." They'd discussed this during their planning sessions around cold campfires, but discussing theory was different from facing reality. These men had ridden together for months, had trusted each other with their lives, had shared the kind of bond that forms between soldiers who faced death together. Now they would part ways and, if their plan succeeded, never see each other again. California for me, James said, trying to sound casual about abandoning the only family he'd known since the war ended. Always wanted to see the ocean. Samuel nodded but said nothing. His own plans were more modest, a small farm in Oregon perhaps, or a business in one of the growing towns along the railroad, someplace where Samuel Clement could die quietly and a new man could be born, with a new name, and a history that didn't include 4 years of guerrilla warfare and one afternoon of bank robbery. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, thick flakes that would cover their tracks and complicate any search efforts that continued through the night. Inside the warm barn, 2 men prepared to say goodbye to each other and to the lives they'd lived up until this moment. In Liberty, meanwhile, the town was coming to terms with its unwanted place in criminal history. Telegraphs were already carrying news of the robbery to sheriffs and federal marshals throughout Missouri and beyond. Rewards would be posted, wanted posters would be drawn up, and the first systematic manhunt for bank robbers in American peacetime would begin. But the men who'd committed America's first daylight bank robbery were already ghosts, fading into the vastness of a continent where a man could disappear completely if he had enough money and enough will to become someone else entirely. The only trace they'd leave behind would be the story itself, growing with each telling, becoming legend even as the real men who'd lived it scattered like leaves in the Missouri wind. Dawn broke gray and cold over Missouri, revealing a transformed landscape. The snow that had begun falling during the night had continued through the dark hours, laying a thick blanket over the countryside that effectively erased the last traces of the previous day's dramatic events. Roads became indistinguishable from fields. Hoofprints disappeared beneath inches of white. Even the blood stain in Liberty's town square was covered, though everyone who'd witnessed George Wymore's death would carry that image for the rest of their lives. Samuel Clement, though that name would soon be discarded like an old coat that no longer fit, stood in the doorway of Martha Hendrick's barn and watched the snow fall with the satisfaction of a man who understood how weather could be an ally. Behind him, James Cunningham was already preparing to leave, dividing their shared portion of the stolen money and making ready for a journey that would take him far from Missouri's bitter memories. "Reckon this is it," James said, his voice carrying the awkwardness that comes when friends prepare to part forever. Samuel turned from watching the snow and studied his companion's face in the gray morning light. They'd shared danger, success, and now the strange melancholy that follows the completion of something that can never be repeated. After today, they would be strangers to each other, if they were wise. "California's a big place," Samuel observed. "Lots of opportunities for a man with capital and sense." "Oregon, too, I'd imagine," James replied, though Samuel had never mentioned his intended destination. They shook hands with the formal courtesy of men who'd shared something significant and understood its value. Then James Cunningham mounted his horse and rode west into the falling snow, carrying $20,000 in stolen money and a new identity that would serve him well in the California gold fields. Samuel watched until his friend's figure was swallowed by the gray and white curtain of the storm. Then he returned to the barn to finalize his own preparations for a transformation that would be as complete as death and rebirth. By noon, Samuel Clement had ceased to exist. The man who emerged from Martha Hendrick's barn carried papers identifying him as Thomas Wilson, a cattle buyer from Kansas whose business had brought him to Missouri at an unfortunate time. Thomas Wilson was a careful man with modest ambitions and a sad story about losing his family in the war. He planned to start over in Oregon, maybe buy a small spread and raise horses. Nothing too ambitious, nothing that would attract attention or questions about the source of his sudden prosperity. The transformation was more than cosmetic. Samuel had learned during the war that successful deception required believing your own story. By the time he rode away from the Hendricks farm, he had begun thinking of himself as Thomas Wilson, had internalized the mannerisms and speech patterns of a man who'd lived a completely different life. It was method acting performed with the stakes of life and death. Meanwhile, Sheriff Jones and his deputies were discovering just how difficult it was to track professional criminals. The river crossing they'd spent hours searching for didn't exist, and now the snow had covered any remaining evidence, turning their investigation into a frustrating exercise in speculation and theory. Federal marshals arrived from Kansas City within 48 hours, bringing with them the resources and authority to mount a proper investigation. They questioned every witness, cataloged every detail, and constructed the kind of systematic profile that would become standard procedure in later decades. But their quarry was already beyond reach, scattered across a continent where individual identity was often a matter of personal declaration rather than official documentation. The robbery of the Clay County Savings Association became the template that every subsequent bank robbery would follow, consciously or otherwise. The careful reconnaissance, the division of labor, the use of overwhelming force to control the situation quickly, the planned escape routes and diversionary tactics, and most importantly, the understanding that success required not just stealing the money, but transforming it into legitimate prosperity without attracting attention. Over the following months, as news of the Liberty robbery spread through newspapers across the country, the story began to change in the telling. The number of robbers increased, the amount stolen grew larger, the violence became more dramatic, and gradually names began to be attached to the crime. Jesse James, Frank James, the younger brothers, men whose reputations were already growing in the folklore of post-war Missouri. Whether any of these famous outlaws were actually involved in the Liberty robbery remains a matter of historical debate. The evidence is circumstantial, the witnesses unreliable, and the suspects had alibis that were difficult to verify, but impossible to disprove. What's certain is that someone robbed the Clay County Savings Association on February 13th, 1866, and that whoever did it set a precedent that would echo through American criminal history for decades. But the real men who committed America's first daylight bank robbery had already vanished into the vastness of a growing nation. Samuel Clement became Thomas Wilson, who eventually settled in Oregon's Willamette Valley and raised horses with moderate success until his death from influenza in 1891. James Cunningham transformed himself into William Patterson and prospered in California's Central Valley, dying wealthy and respected in 1904 without ever being connected to his Missouri past. David Martinez, who'd led the false trail through the river bottoms, became Diego Morales and spent 20 years as a successful merchant in New Mexico before a heart attack claimed him in 1887. The others scattered equally completely, taking their secrets with them to graves that bore names their mothers never gave them. The money they stole was never recovered because it was never sought in the right places. Instead of being hoarded or spent foolishly, it was invested carefully in legitimate businesses across the American West. A horse ranch in Oregon, a general store in California, a freight company in Colorado. The stolen wealth of the Clay County Savings Association became the seed money for dozens of respectable enterprises that contributed to the development of the frontier. And in Liberty, Missouri, life gradually returned to normal, though the town would never quite forget its unwanted moment of historical significance. The Clay County Savings Association reopened in a new location with better locks and more security. George Wymore was buried with honors befitting a victim of criminal violence. And the story of February 13th, 1866, began its transformation from fact to legend. Winter passed into spring, and spring into summer, and the immediate trauma of that cold February afternoon began to fade into the kind of story that old men tell in barbershops and general stores. But the ripples from those 20 minutes in the Clay County Savings Association continued to spread outward like circles from a stone dropped in still water. Across the American West, other groups of desperate men took note of what had happened in Liberty. If 7 former guerrillas could walk into a bank in broad daylight and escape with $60,000, what was to stop others from attempting similar enterprises? The success of the Liberty robbery inspired imitators, and those imitators would eventually create the golden age of bank robbery that defined much of the late 19th century. But for the men who'd actually committed the first such crime, success meant something different than fame or notoriety. It meant the chance to disappear completely, to become new people with clean histories and legitimate futures. In an age when personal identity was still largely a matter of individual declaration, this was more possible than it would be in later decades of fingerprints and federal databases. Thomas Wilson, formerly Samuel Clement, spent his first summer in Oregon learning to be a horse breeder. His spread along the Willamette River was modest but prosperous, and his neighbors found him to be a quiet, hard-working man who paid his debts and minded his own business. If he sometimes seemed to know more about military tactics than most cattle ranchers, or if he occasionally woke his household with dreams that made him cry out in his sleep, well, those were common enough traits among men who'd survived the recent war. William Patterson, who'd once been James Cunningham, discovered an aptitude for commerce that surprised him. His general store in California's Central Valley became a gathering place for farmers and miners who appreciated his fair prices and his willingness to extend credit to honest men down on their luck. He married a widow with 2 children, adopted them as his own, and lived quietly prosperous until his death from old age in 1904. The others scattered equally completely across the vastness of America, carrying their secret with them to graves marked with names that bore no connection to a cold February afternoon in Missouri. They became farmers and merchants, fathers and grandfathers, pillars of communities that never suspected their peaceful neighbors had once been among the most wanted men in the nation. And gradually, as the years passed and the immediate memory of the Liberty robbery faded, the crime itself began to transform in the public imagination. Details became confused, participants multiplied, and the relatively bloodless reality of the actual event gave way to increasingly dramatic retellings that emphasized violence and adventure over careful planning and professional execution. By 1870, dime novelists were attributing the robbery to Jesse James and his gang, though Jesse would have been 18 years old and recovering from a war wound at the time. By 1880, the story had grown to include a running gunfight through the streets of Liberty and a dramatic chase across half of Missouri. By 1890, the robbery that had actually involved 7 men and claimed 1 victim had become an epic of frontier justice, featuring dozens of participants and bodies scattered across the countryside. The real story was both more mundane and more remarkable than the legend. More mundane because it succeeded through careful planning rather than desperate courage, because it relied on preparation rather than luck, because its perpetrators were practical men pursuing financial security rather than romantic figures seeking adventure. More remarkable because it represented something entirely new in American crime: the application of military tactics and organization to civilian criminal purposes. The Clay County Savings Association building still stands today on the square in Liberty, Missouri, though it now houses a museum dedicated to preserving the memory of that February afternoon in 1866. Visitors can see the original vault, still bearing the scars of forced entry, and examine artifacts from the investigation that followed. They can read contemporary newspaper accounts that capture the shock and bewilderment of a community confronting a type of crime it had never seen before. But the museum cannot tell them the names of the men who actually committed the robbery, because those names died with the men who once bore them. The real perpetrators of America's first daylight bank robbery took their secret with them into graves scattered across the American West, leaving behind only the echo of their achievement and the precedent they established for every bank robber who followed. On quiet nights in the Willamette Valley, when the wind whispers through the oak trees that Thomas Wilson planted on his horse ranch, you might imagine you can still hear the hoofbeats of 7 riders disappearing into a Missouri snowstorm. In the Central Valley of California, where William Patterson's descendants still work land, he bought with money whose origins they never suspected. The ghosts of desperate men who chose transformation over destruction might pause to admire what their grandfather accomplished with his stolen fortune. And in Liberty, Missouri, when February snow falls on the town square and lamplight flickers behind windows, just as it did on that cold afternoon in 1866, the past feels close enough to touch. Close enough to hear the brass bell above the bank door chiming its welcome to customers whose business was anything but ordinary. Close enough to see the bloodstain in the snow where George Wymore fell, dying for the crime of being in the wrong place when history decided to change direction. The story of the Liberty Bank robbery is finished, but its echoes continue to resonate through American criminal history. Every bank robber who followed, from the James Gang to John Dillinger to modern-day desperados with automatic weapons and getaway cars, walked in footprints first pressed into Missouri snow by 7 men whose real names we'll never know. They succeeded not because they were the smartest or the bravest or the most ruthless, but because they understood that the greatest crime is often the one that looks most ordinary, the one that leaves behind no heroes or villains, only questions that can never be answered and mysteries that deepen with time. Sleep now and dream of snowy afternoons and quiet transformations, of men who became legends by refusing to become legends at all, of secrets carried to unmarked graves and fortunes built on foundations that history has forgotten. Dream of a time when identity was fluid and the past could be discarded like an old coat, when a man could disappear completely into the vastness of America and emerge as someone entirely new. The wind still blows across Missouri, carrying whispers of that February afternoon when 7 strangers rode into Liberty and rode out as ghosts. And somewhere in that wind, if you listen carefully, you might hear the echo of hoofbeats fading into legend, leaving behind only the memory of perfect crime and the knowledge that sometimes the most remarkable stories are the ones that nobody remembers exactly as they happened. The brass bell above the bank door has long since stopped chiming, but on nights like these, when winter holds the world in its quiet embrace, you might imagine you can still hear its welcome to customers whose business changed American crime forever.